I don't want to go back to Boston anymore. My name's Juniper Elise Callahan, 32 years old, born and raised in the scrappy outskirts of Detroit. I'm a mechanic by trade, hands always smudged with grease, hair usually tied back in a messy knot. Growing up, I learned to fix anything with an engine. Guess it's why I've always had a soft spot for my beat-up Ford F-150. I'm not one for fancy. Give me a cold beer and a starry night over a five-star hotel any day. Life's been a grind, but I've got a restless streak, always chasing the next adventure. That's how I ended up planning this solo road trip, craving some fresh air and a break from the city noise. Boston wasn't even on my radar at first. I'd been aiming for Maine, picturing quiet woods and a crackling campfire. But a buddy from back home, Theo, kept yapping about how Boston's got this gritty charm. Old brick buildings, salty harbor air, and history that feels alive. He said I'd love the camping spots just outside the city, tucked along the coast. I figured why not? A detour wouldn't kill me. So, I packed up my gear, tent, cooler, a couple of dog-eared paperbacks, and hit the road, humming along to Springsteen like it was some grand escape. The drive from Detroit was long, about 12 hours if you don't count the stops for gas and greasy diner fries. I rolled into Massachusetts feeling that buzz you get when you're somewhere new. Boston hit me with its mix of old-world vibes and chaotic energy, cobblestone streets clashing with honking traffic. I didn't linger in the city, though. I'd scoped out a spot called World's End, a peninsula just south of Boston with trails and shoreline perfect for camping. Sounded peaceful, right? A place to kick back, breathe, maybe sketch a little in my notebook. I got there late afternoon, sun dipping low, painting the sky orange. The place was stunning. Rolling hills, salt marsh stretching out toward the harbor, waves lapping in the distance. I found a secluded spot near some trees, far enough from the main path that it felt like mine. Setting up camp was second nature. Tent pitched, fire pit dug, cooler cracked open. I sat there, sipping a beer, watching the flames dance. It was perfect. Too perfect, maybe. I didn't know it yet. But that quiet was just the calm before something horror show level scary was about to unfold. You ever get that feeling like you're being watched? Not paranoid, just off? I brushed it off as road trip jitters. Detroit's got its share of creeps. I'm used to keeping my guard up. But out here, surrounded by nature, I let it slip. I figured the worst I'd deal with was a raccoon raiding my snacks. Man, was I wrong. The air had this chill that wasn't just the ocean breeze. Something heavy, like the place was holding its breath. I shook it off, tossed another log on the fire, and told myself to chill out. Looking back, I should have paid attention to the little things. The way the birds went quiet all at once, like someone flipped a switch. Or how the water in the distance seemed to ripple without any wind. I'm not superstitious, never bought into ghost stories or Detroit's urban legends about cursed factories. But Boston's got its own flavor of weird, tied up in old tales of shipwrecks and lost souls. Theo used to ramble about some harbor myth, a drowned sailor who drags folks under. I laughed it off then. Didn't seem so funny later. I settled into my sleeping bag that night, the fire dying down to embers. The stars were out, bright as hell, and I felt this dumb little grin creep up. Solo trips are my thing. Nobody to bug me, just me and the open road. I thought I'd found my slice of peace out here. Figured I'd wake up to seagulls and coffee, maybe hike a bit before heading north. That's how it was supposed to go anyway. But the universe had other plans, and they were about to get real disturbing. By midnight, I was half asleep, cozy in my tent, when something shifted. Not a sound, not a shadow, just a feeling deep in my gut, like the ground itself was uneasy. I told myself it was nothing, rolled over, and tried to drift off. But that moment stuck with me, nagging like a splinter. Whatever was coming, it was already creeping closer, and I was too damn stubborn to see it. I woke up to a gray sky, the kind that makes you feel like the day's already pissed off. My fire pit was a soggy mess. Guess it rained overnight, though I didn't hear a drop. Weird, but not enough to freak me out yet. I crawled out of the tent, stretched, and fired up my little camp stove for coffee. The air smelled like salt and damp earth, and I could hear the harbor waves rolling in, steady as a heartbeat. World's End felt different in the daylight, less cozy, more exposed. I shook off the unease and gulped down my brew, figuring a hike would get my head straight. The trails were muddy, sucking at my boots with every step. I'd packed light, just a water bottle, my pocket knife, and a granola bar, but the weight of the place was starting to hit me. I kept thinking about Theo's dumb sailor story. What did he say? Something about a guy who drowned out here, back when ships still crashed into the rocks. Locals swore he'd show up sometimes, all bloated and mad, looking for company. I chuckled to myself. Horror tales like that are just campfire bait. Still, the thought stuck like gum on a shoe. About an hour in, my phone crapped out. No signal, no GPS, just a blank screen mocking me. I'm no tech wizard, but I know a dead zone when I see one. Annoying, sure, but I've got a decent sense of direction, grew up finding my way around Detroit's maze of backstreets. I kept going, following the trail markers, until I hit a fork I didn't remember from the map. One path veered toward the marsh, the other deeper into the woods. I picked the woods, figuring it'd loop back eventually. Bad call, but I didn't know that yet. Halfway down that path, I found something odd. A rusted anchor half buried in the dirt, like it had been there forever. No way it washed up this far inland. I crouched down, running my fingers over the pitted metal. It felt wrong, heavy with some kind of history I couldn't place. I'm not one to spook easy, but that thing gave me a shiver, the disturbing kind you can't shake. I stood up quick, telling myself it was just junk, probably from some old boat. Still, I snapped a pic with my dead phone out of habit. The rest of the hike was a slog. My boots were caked in mud, and the trees started closing in, branches scratching at my jacket like they wanted a piece of me. I kept going, but that anchor kept nagging at me. Why'd it feel so personal? By the time I got back to camp, the sky was darkening again, too early for night, more like a storm brewing. I decided to pack up early, maybe find a diner in Boston proper. Solo camping's great until the weather turns on you, right? Back at my site, I started breaking down the tent when I noticed the cooler. It was open, food scattered, chips, a sandwich, even my spare beer, all torn up like a raccoon had a field day. Except the mess wasn't random. It was spread out in a circle, deliberate-like. My gut twisted. I've seen critters raid camps before, but this felt off, almost scary. I scanned the trees, half expecting some punk kid to pop out laughing. Nothing. Just silence, thick and heavy. I told myself to chill. Maybe it was a fox, or hell, a gust of wind I didn't notice. I stuffed everything into my pack, ready to call it a day, when I saw the scratches. 3 long gouges on my tent flap, deep enough to tear the fabric. Not claws, too clean, too straight, like someone dragged a knife across it. My heart kicked up a notch. I'm no stranger to trouble. Detroit taught me how to spot it, but this was different. This was out of my league. I stood there, staring at those marks, debating my next move. Stay and tough it out? Head into town? The smart play was to bounce, but something stubborn in me, probably the same dumb streak that got me into bar fights back home, wanted to figure it out. I grabbed my knife, checked the blade, and decided to poke around a bit before bailing. That's when I heard it, a low hum, faint, coming from the marsh. Not a sound you'd expect out here, and it was getting closer. That hum from the marsh stuck in my head like a bad tune. I gripped my pocket knife tighter, the blade catching the last bit of daylight as I edged toward the sound. I'm not some hero type. Hell, I've run from fights I knew I couldn't win, but curiosity's always been my kryptonite. The air got thicker the closer I got, salty and damp, like the harbor was breathing down my neck. I told myself it was probably a boat motor or some weird echo off the water. Yeah, keep dreaming, Juniper. The marsh opened up ahead, all reeds and murky pools stretching out under a sky that looked ready to choke on itself. The hum wasn't a hum anymore. It was sharper, like a voice trying to form words but failing. I froze, scanning the horizon. That's when I saw it. A figure, way out in the water, just standing there. Not wading, not swimming, standing, like the marsh was shallow as a puddle. My stomach did a flip. I've seen some shady characters in Detroit, but this was next level disturbing. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. The figure was tall, lanky, draped in something dark and tattered. Old clothes, maybe, or seaweed hanging off like a messed up cape. No face I could see, just a smudge where one should have been. I blinked hard, thinking it was a trick of the light, but it didn't budge. Then it moved. Not toward me, not away, just a twitch, like it knew I was watching. My mouth went dry. Horror doesn't even cover it. This was straight up scary, the kind that makes you question your own eyes. I took a step back, boots squelching in the mud, and that's when the smell hit me. Not fishy, not rot. Something sour, like wet metal and regret. It wasn't natural, not out here. I've smelled some nasty stuff working on engines, but this was alive, personal. The figure twitched again, and the hum spiked, loud enough to buzz in my teeth. I stumbled, nearly dropping my knife, and booked it back toward camp. No way I was sticking around to say hi. By the time I hit my site, my heart was hammering like a piston. The tent was still half-packed, cooler still a mess, but I didn't care. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting that thing to come lurching out of the trees. Nothing yet, but the air felt wrong. Too still, too heavy. I started shoving gear into my pack, hands shaking. I'm not proud of it, but panic was calling the shots. That's when I saw the water. A puddle near my fire pit. Fresh, like someone dumped it there. Except it wasn't raining, and I hadn't spilled a damn thing. I crouched down, staring at it. Tiny ripples spread out, like something invisible was tapping the surface. My skin crawled. I've heard those old Boston tales, sailors lost at sea, dragged to the bottom by something pissed off and restless. Theo'd laugh his ass off if he knew I was even thinking it. But this wasn't a story anymore. This was real, and it was closing in. I stood up fast, ready to bolt, when the hum came back. Louder, closer, right behind me. I spun around, knife out, and there it was. Not 10 feet away, standing at the edge of my camp. That same figure, dripping wet, head tilted like it was sizing me up. Up close, I could see more. Pale skin stretched tight, eyes like black pits, mouth gaping open with water pouring out. Not trickling, pouring, like a busted pipe. It didn't move, just stared, and I swear I felt it in my bones, this deep, cold terror that said I wasn't getting out of this easy. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, just stood there, locked in place. Then it spoke. Not words, not really. A gurgle, wet and broken, but it hit me like a punch. Mine. That's what it sounded like. My legs finally woke up, and I backed away, tripping over my own damn pack. It didn't chase, didn't lunge, just watched, water pooling around its feet, spreading toward me. I scrambled up, grabbed what I could, and ran for the trail. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and it sure as hell wasn't letting me off the hook. I ran like hell, legs burning, lungs screaming for air. The trail was a blur of mud and branches slapping my face, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. That thing back at camp, with its black pit eyes and that voice like a drowned curse, was burned into my head. I've dodged some scary stuff in Detroit, drunk guys with knives, stray dogs with teeth, but this was horror on a whole other level. My pack bounced against my back, half-zipped, spilling socks and a flashlight I didn't have time to grab. All I had was my knife and a prayer. The hum chased me, low and steady, weaving through the trees like it knew the way better than I did. I kept picturing that water pouring out of its mouth, pooling closer, and my gut told me if it caught me, I'd be done. I hit the fork in the trail again, marsh one way, woods the other, and bolted for the marsh this time. Bad move, maybe, but I figured open ground might give me a shot at outrunning it. The ground turned soft, sucking at my boots, slowing me down. I cursed under my breath, panic clawing up my throat. That's when I heard the splash. Not behind me, ahead. I skidded to a stop, chest heaving. And there it was again, standing in the marsh, knee-deep in black water. How'd it get in front of me? My mind spun, but I didn't have time to figure it out. It started moving, slow, deliberate, cutting through the reeds like a shark. Water rippled out from it, dark and oily, and that smell hit me again, sour and wrong. I turned to run back, but the trail was gone, swallowed by fog rolling in thick and fast. I was trapped, and it knew it. I gripped my knife, hands slick with sweat, and backed up until my boots hit water. The marsh was cold, seeping into my jeans, and I could feel it pulling at me, like it wanted me under. The thing stopped maybe 20 feet away, head cocked, staring. Then it raised an arm, long, bony, dripping, and pointed right at me. The hum turned into a growl, deep and rattling, and the water around me started bubbling. Not boiling, just alive. I've never felt terror like that, the kind that says you're already dead and just don't know it yet. I swung my knife wild, slashing at nothing, yelling to keep myself sane. "Stay back, you freak." My voice cracked, but it felt good to fight, even if it was pointless. The thing didn't flinch, just stepped closer, water sloshing around its legs. I turned and waded deeper into the marsh, half running, half swimming, reeds tangling around my ankles. I could hear it behind me, that wet shuffle, and I knew I was in a life and death mess. One slip, one wrong move, and I'd be gone. Something grabbed my leg, not a hand, more like a pull, cold and strong. I kicked hard, thrashing, and broke free, but it cost me my knife. It sank into the murk, and I didn't look back to see if that thing was closer. I kept going, chest deep now, until I hit a shallow patch and hauled myself onto a muddy bank. My lungs were on fire, my hands shaking, but I could see lights, distant, faint, maybe a road. Hope's a hell of a drug, and I latched onto it, stumbling forward through the fog. The hum faded for a sec, and I thought maybe I'd lost it. I was wrong. A shadow loomed to my left, tall and jagged, and I ducked just as something swiped over my head. Wet, heavy, like a soaked rope. I didn't stop to look, just ran, tripping over roots and rocks, toward those lights. My mind was screaming. Car, road, people, anything to get me out of this nightmare. The ground firmed up under me, asphalt biting my soles, and I saw headlights cutting through the haze. I waved my arms like a lunatic, yelling hoarse and raw. A truck screeched to a stop, some guy in a flannel shirt leaning out the window, wide-eyed. "What the hell's wrong with you?" he barked. I didn't answer, just climbed into the bed, gasping, "Drive now." He didn't argue, thank God, and peeled out. I collapsed back there, soaked and shivering, watching the fog swallow the marsh behind us. The hum was gone, but I could still feel those eyes on me, promising something disturbing was unfinished. The guy in the truck didn't ask too many questions, which was fine by me. I was a mess, soaked to the bone, mud caked up to my knees, breathing like I'd just run a marathon. He dropped me off at a gas station outside Boston, some neon-lit joint with a flickering sign. I mumbled a thanks, hauled my sorry self inside, and bought a coffee with the crumpled bills in my pocket. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I sat there, staring at the steam curling up from the cup. That thing in the marsh, whatever it was, had me rattled, and the horror of it was still sinking in. I kept replaying it in my head. The way it moved, the water pouring out, that word, mine. What the hell did it want? I've dealt with creepy before. Detroit's got abandoned warehouses that'd make your skin crawl. But this was different, personal. I pulled out my phone, still dead, and cursed myself for not grabbing my pack. All my gear, my tent gone. But I was alive, and that's what mattered. Or so I thought. The clerk gave me a weird look, probably wondering why I smelled like a swamp, but I just sipped my coffee and tried to figure out my next move. I hitched a ride back to Detroit the next day with a trucker heading west. Nice guy, talked about his dog the whole way, which kept my mind off the scary stuff. Back home, I crashed hard, slept for 14 hours straight, dreaming of black water and that gurgling voice. When I woke up, I figured it was over. Boston was behind me, just a bad memory I'd laugh about someday. I hit the shop, fixed a couple engines, cracked a beer with Theo, told him the short version, left out the part where I nearly pissed myself. He smirked, said I should have known Boston's got ghosts. I rolled my eyes and let it go. Days turned into weeks, and I started feeling normal again. The nightmares faded, the shakes stopped. I even planned another trip, nothing crazy, just a weekend up north. But then I found it. I was cleaning out my jacket, the one I'd worn that night, and there it was in the pocket. A small, rusted piece of metal, shaped like a hook. Part of that anchor I'd seen on the trail. My stomach dropped. I hadn't put it there. I'd barely touched the damn thing. It felt cold, heavier than it should have been, and I swear it hummed when I held it. I should have tossed it. That was my mistake. Instead, I set it on my dresser, figuring it was just a souvenir, a dumb reminder of a wild night. That night, I woke up to water dripping. Not from a leak, my ceiling was dry. It was coming from the dresser, pooling around that hook, spreading across the floor. My heart kicked into overdrive. I stumbled out of bed, and there it was in the corner, a shadow, tall and wet, staring at me with those pit eyes. The room filled with that sour smell, and the hum started up, loud and close. I bolted, didn't even grab shoes, just ran out into the street, barefoot, yelling like a lunatic. Neighbors flicked on lights, dogs barked, but I kept going until I hit a 24-hour diner a mile away. I sat there, panting, while the waitress poured me coffee and eyed me like I'd lost it. Maybe I had. When I went back at dawn, the hook was gone, the water too. But the damage was done. That thing followed me home, and I'd brought it here with that stupid piece of metal. A deadly mistake, and I'm paying for it. Now, I don't sleep much. Every drip, every creak, I'm on edge, waiting for it to show up again. I've tried salt lines, prayers, even chucking every damn thing I own that might tie me to Boston. Nothing works. Last night, I saw it outside my window, standing in the alley, water pooling under the streetlight. It's not done with me. I keep thinking about Theo's story, that sailor dragging folks under. Maybe it's not just a myth. Maybe it's a tragedy I'm stuck in, and there's no getting out. I'm writing this down now, hoping someone finds it if I don't make it. If you're ever out near Boston, camping at World's End, and you see an anchor or hear that hum, run. Don't touch anything. Don't look back. I didn't, and now I'm marked. This isn't just a disturbing memory anymore. It's my life, and it's slipping away one wet step at a time. I almost lost my life in Boston. My name's Juniper Elise Callahan, 32 years old, born and raised in the scrappy outskirts of Detroit. I'm a mechanic by trade, hands always smudged with grease, hair usually tied back in a messy knot. Growing up, I learned to fix anything with an engine. Guess it's why I've always had a soft spot for my beat-up Ford F-150. I'm not one for fancy. Give me a cold beer and a starry night over a five-star hotel any day. Life's been a grind, but I've got a restless streak, always chasing the next adventure. That's how I ended up planning this solo road trip, craving some fresh air and a break from the city noise. Boston wasn't even on my radar at first. I'd been aiming for Maine, picturing quiet woods and a crackling campfire. But a buddy from back home, Theo, kept yapping about how Boston's got this gritty charm. Old brick buildings, salty harbor air, and history that feels alive. He said I'd love the camping spots just outside the city, tucked along the coast. I figured why not? A detour wouldn't kill me. So, I packed up my gear, tent, cooler, a couple of dog-eared paperbacks, and hit the road, humming along to Springsteen like it was some grand escape. The drive from Detroit was long, about 12 hours if you don't count the stops for gas and greasy diner fries. I rolled into Massachusetts feeling that buzz you get when you're somewhere new. Boston hit me with its mix of old-world vibes and chaotic energy, cobblestone streets clashing with honking traffic. I didn't linger in the city, though. I'd scoped out a spot called World's End, a peninsula just south of Boston with trails and shoreline perfect for camping. Sounded peaceful, right? A place to kick back, breathe, maybe sketch a little in my notebook. I got there late afternoon, sun dipping low, painting the sky orange. The place was stunning. Rolling hills, salt marsh stretching out toward the harbor, waves lapping in the distance. I found a secluded spot near some trees, far enough from the main path that it felt like mine. Setting up camp was second nature. Tent pitched, fire pit dug, cooler cracked open. I sat there, sipping a beer, watching the flames dance. It was perfect. Too perfect, maybe. I didn't know it yet, but that quiet was just the calm before something horror show level scary was about to unfold. You ever get that feeling like you're being watched? Not paranoid, just off? I brushed it off as road trip jitters. Detroit's got its share of creeps. I'm used to keeping my guard up. But out here, surrounded by nature, I let it slip. I figured the worst I'd deal with was a raccoon raiding my snacks. Man, was I wrong. The air had this chill that wasn't just the ocean breeze. Something heavy, like the place was holding its breath. I shook it off, tossed another log on the fire, and told myself to chill out. Looking back, I should have paid attention to the little things. The way the birds went quiet all at once, like someone flipped a switch. Or how the water in the distance seemed to ripple without any wind. I'm not superstitious, never bought into ghost stories or Detroit's urban legends about cursed factories. But Boston's got its own flavor of weird, tied up in old tales of shipwrecks and lost souls. Theo used to ramble about some harbor myth, a drowned sailor who drags folks under. I laughed it off then. Didn't seem so funny later. I settled into my sleeping bag that night, the fire dying down to embers. The stars were out, bright as hell, and I felt this dumb little grin creep up. Solo trips are my thing. Nobody to bug me, just me and the open road. I thought I'd found my slice of peace out here. Figured I'd wake up to seagulls and coffee, maybe hike a bit before heading north. That's how it was supposed to go anyway. But the universe had other plans, and they were about to get real disturbing. By midnight, I was half asleep, cozy in my tent, when something shifted. Not a sound, not a shadow, just a feeling deep in my gut, like the ground itself was uneasy. I told myself it was nothing, rolled over, and tried to drift off. But that moment stuck with me, nagging like a splinter. Whatever was coming, it was already creeping closer, and I was too damn stubborn to see it. I woke up to a damp sleeping bag and a headache that felt like someone taking a hammer to my skull. The tent smelled like wet dirt, and my fire was out, drowned by a puddle that shouldn't have been there. No rain overnight, far as I could tell. I groaned, crawled out, and squinted at the gray dawn creeping over the blue hills. The pond was still, glassy, like it was holding its breath. I rubbed my eyes, figuring I'd slept weird after those blurry shots freaked me out. Coffee'd fix me up, right? Wrong. I fired up my little stove, hands fumbling with the canister, and that's when I noticed my camera. It was sitting outside the tent, lens cap off, perched on a rock like I'd left it there. Except I hadn't. I'd zipped it into my bag before crashing. My stomach did a little flip. I'm messy, sure. Chicago's chaos trained me that way, but I don't mess with my gear. I grabbed it, checked the screen, and saw the last photo. That pale streak again, right at the water's edge, practically glowing. Disturbing? Yeah, and then some. I shook it off, told myself some animal must have nudged it out. Raccoons, maybe? But the zipper was still closed. No tears, no tracks. I sipped my coffee, bitter and lukewarm, and decided to hike it off. The Blue Hills trails were calling, rugged paths winding up to overlooks, perfect for clearing my head. I packed light, camera, water, a protein bar, and hit the trail behind my sight. The woods were thick, pines scratching at the sky, and the air had this bite that made me wish I'd brought a heavier jacket. About a mile in, I found something that stopped me cold. A tree, big, old oak, carved up with lines that didn't look random. Not initials, not graffiti, deep, jagged cuts, like someone hacked at it with a blade, over and over. I ran my fingers over the gashes, feeling the sap still sticky. Fresh. I've seen vandalism in the city, tags on walls, busted windows, but this felt different, angry in a way that set my nerves jangling. I snapped a quick pic, figuring it'd make a gritty shot, but the hairs on my neck were up. The hike got weirder from there. My camera battery, fully charged last night, started dying, screen flickering, shutting off mid-shot. I cursed, swapped it out, but the new one tanked too. Tech glitches happen, sure, but twice in a row? I kept going, stubborn as hell. Chicago grit doesn't quit, but the trail started feeling off. Markers were missing, paths doubling back on themselves. I've got a decent sense of direction, but I was looping, and the pond kept popping up in sight, like it was pulling me back. By noon, I was sweaty and pissed, trudging back to camp with a half-dead camera and a gnawing vibe I couldn't shake. That's when I saw the pond again, and the ripples. Not wind, not fish, just tight little circles spreading out from the center, steady as a heartbeat. I froze, watching, and something broke the surface. Not a head, not a hand, just a flash of white, gone fast. My mouth went dry. I've heard Boston's got old stories. Witches in these hills, curses tied to the land. Thought it was tourist bait till now. Back at my site, I found my tent stakes pulled up, not loose, yanked clean out and tossed in a pile. My fire pit was scattered too, rocks kicked around like someone had a tantrum. I've camped enough to know wind doesn't do that. My gut said leave, pack up, hit the road, call it a wash. But I'm a dumbass sometimes, too curious for my own good. I decided to stick it out one more night, figure out what was screwing with me. I reset the stakes, rebuilt the fire, and sat there, camera in hand, waiting. Dusk rolled in, and the pond went quiet again. No birds, no bugs, just that heavy silence that makes you feel small. I was poking the fire when I heard it, a low scrape, like metal on wood, coming from the trees. Not loud, but close. I grabbed my flashlight, swung it around, and saw nothing but shadows. My heart kicked up, but I told myself it was a branch, an animal, anything normal. Then the scrape came again, sharper, and I swear the air got colder. Whatever was out there, it was watching, and I just made it mad. That scrape in the trees stuck with me, like a splinter I couldn't dig out. I sat by the fire, flashlight in one hand, camera in the other, eyes darting to every flicker in the dark. The Blue Hills felt alive now, not in a good way, more like something was pacing just out of sight, sizing me up. I'm no stranger to sketchy vibes. Chicago's got alleys that'd make you clutch your wallet, But this was horror-level scary, the kind that makes your skin feel too tight. I told myself to chill, but my gut wasn't buying it. The scrape came again, closer, from the pond this time. I swung the flashlight over, beam cutting through the dark, and caught something. White, slick, sliding under the water fast. Not a fish, not a log. Too big, too smooth. My breath hitched. I stood up, legs shaky, and aimed the light steady. The ripples were back, spreading out slow and deliberate, like whatever was down there wanted me to see. I've shot photos in some creepy spots, but this was disturbing, straight out of a nightmare I didn't sign up for. Then it surfaced. Not all at once, just a hand first, pale and bony, clawing up through the pond like it was climbing out of a grave. My heart slammed against my ribs. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, and it rolled, beams spinning wild. The hand gripped the bank, water streaming off it, and then the rest came up, long, thin, wrapped in something dark and soggy, like old cloth or skin that had been underwater too long. No face yet, just a shape, hunched and dripping, staring at me from the shadows. I grabbed my camera, dumb instinct, I guess, and snapped a shot. The flash popped, and for a split second, I saw it clear. Eyes like cracked glass, wide and empty, mouth stretched too big, teeth jagged like broken shells. The photo didn't matter. That image was burned into me. It didn't scream or charge, just stood there, water pooling around its feet, and let out this sound, a low keen that hit me like a punch. I've heard trains wail back home, but this was alive, angry, and way too close. I bolted for my tent, thinking I'd grab my keys and run. Bad move. The air turned thick, wet, like I was breathing fog, and that smell hit. Rotten, sharp, like meat left out too long. I gagged, fumbling with the zipper, when I heard it shuffle behind me. Not fast, just steady, squelching through the mud. I spun around, and it was halfway across my camp, dragging one leg like it didn't care how slow it went. Knew I wasn't getting far. My fire sputtered, flames shrinking like they were scared too. Inside the tent, I snatched my bag, hands shaking so bad I dropped it twice. My keys were buried under ramen packs and a spare lens. Stupid. Soren. Real stupid. I could hear it outside now, that keen turning into a hiss, wet and ragged. I peeked through the flap, and it was right there, crouched by the fire pit, clawing at the dirt with those bony fingers. It didn't look at me, just kept digging, like it was marking something. My brain screamed run, but my legs were jelly, stuck watching this terror play out. Then it stopped. Head snapped up, those glass eyes locked on me, and I swear it grinned, teeth glinting in the dying firelight. I yanked the keys free, tore out the back of the tent, and ran for the trail. Branches clawed at my face, mud sucked at my shoes, but I didn't care. The hiss followed, loud now, bouncing off the trees like it was everywhere. I hit a clearing, lungs burning, and saw the pond again. Impossible. I'd run the other way. That thing was back in the water, waist deep, watching me, hands trailing the surface like it owned the damn place. I didn't stop, kept running, tripping over roots, until I hit asphalt. A road, finally. Headlights flashed, some SUV swerving as I waved like a maniac. The driver, a guy with a beard and a Red Sox cap, yelled out the window, "You drunk or what?" I didn't answer, just climbed in, gasping, "Go, please go." He grumbled, but hit the gas, and I collapsed in the seat, staring out the back window. The pond was gone, swallowed by trees, but I could still feel those eyes, promising something scary wasn't done with me yet. The SUV peeled out, tires squealing on the wet road, and I slumped in the seat, chest heaving like I'd outrun death itself. The driver, beard guy, kept glancing at me, muttering about crazy kids, but I didn't care. My hands were shaking, still feeling that hiss rattling in my skull. I've dodged some hairy stuff in Chicago, muggings, bar fights, but this was horror on steroids, a life-and-death sprint I wasn't sure I'd won. Out the window, the blue hills blurred into black, and I prayed that thing was stuck back at the pond. We hit a bend, headlights slicing through the dark, when the guy slammed the brakes. I lurched forward, smacking the dash. "What the hell?" he barked, pointing ahead. The road was blocked, not by a car, but water, spilling across the asphalt like a busted dam. Not a puddle, a flood, dark and moving, creeping toward us. My stomach sank. That smell hit again, rotten, sharp, and I knew it wasn't some freak rain. "Turn around," I croaked, voice shot. He cursed, threw it in reverse, but the engine sputtered and died. I didn't wait. Kicked the door open and bolted, bare feet slapping the pavement. Beard guy yelled after me, but I wasn't sticking around to play mechanic. The water was rising fast, lapping at my ankles, cold as hell and tugging like it had hands. I've seen floods back home, rivers busting over bridges, but this was alive, chasing me. Behind me, that Keene started up again, low and close, cutting through the night. I risked a look back and saw it. Tall, pale, wading through the flood like it was nothing, eyes glinting in the dark. I ran harder, lungs screaming, legs burning. The road climbed a hill, and I scrambled up, slipping on wet gravel. That thing didn't run, just glided, steady and sure, like it knew I'd tire out. My mind was a mess. Get high, get away, don't look back. I hit the top, gasping, and saw lights. Houses, maybe a mile off. Hope kicked in, but then the ground shook, a rumble deep enough to rattle my teeth. The water surged, crashing up the hill, and I dove behind a tree just as it slammed past, spraying muck and that scary stink everywhere. It wasn't stopping. I peeked out, and there it was, halfway up, clawing the slope with those jagged hands. The flood parted around it, like it was calling the shots. I bolted again, weaving through trees, branches snapping in my face. My foot caught a root, and I went down hard, rolling into a ditch. Pain shot through my ankle, but I didn't care. Crawled out, mud caked on my hands, and kept going. That hiss was right behind me now, so close I could feel the air shift, wet and heavy. I hit a clearing, some old picnic area, tables rotting in the weeds. Headlights flashed, a pickup truck idling on a side road. I waved, yelling hoarse and raw, and it screeched toward me. The driver, an older woman with a smoker's rasp, leaned out. "Get in, kid. You look like hell." I didn't argue. Threw myself into the cab, slamming the door. She gunned it, tires spinning, and I twisted to look back. The thing was at the edge of the clearing, water pooling around it, just staring. No chase, just that grin, promising something disturbing. We barreled down back roads, her griping about reckless hikers, me nodding like I wasn't losing my mind. My ankle throbbed, my shirt was soaked, but I was breathing, alive for now. She dropped me at a diner off Route 93, neon buzzing in the dark. I stumbled in, ordered a coffee I couldn't taste, and sat there, watching the window. The terror was still out there, tied to that pond, those hills. I'd escaped, sure, but it felt temporary, like I'd just kicked the can down a very short road. Folks in the diner stared, muddy photographer, wild-eyed, nursing a mug like it was a lifeline. I didn't care. My camera was gone, my gear too, but I'd made it out. Or so I thought. As the waitress refilled my cup, I saw it, my reflection in the glass, and behind me, a flicker of white, pale and wet, just for a second. My heart stopped. It wasn't over. That thing wasn't done, and I'd just hauled ass right into its next move. I sat in that diner till the coffee went cold, staring at the window where that flicker had been. My hands wouldn't quit trembling, and every clink of a spoon made me jump. The waitress kept eyeballing me, probably wondering if I was high or just nuts. I wasn't. Well, not the first one anyway. The horror of that thing in the Blue Hills clung to me like damp rot, and I couldn't shake the feeling I'd dragged it out with me. I paid with soggy bills from my pocket, mumbled a thanks, and hitched a ride back to Chicago with a trucker hauling steel. Thought distance might fix it. Big nope. Back home, I crashed at my apartment. Grubby little place near the L tracks, all brick and noise. First night, I slept like the dead, figuring exhaustion would bury the scary stuff. Woke up to water on my floor, puddle by the bed, no leak, no spill. My heart kicked into gear. I've lived in dumps. Leaky pipes are my jam. But this was different, deliberate. I mopped it up, told myself it was a fluke, and went back to life. Shot some gigs, drank with friends, tried to laugh off Boston like it was a bad trip. Then the photos started showing up. Not mine, random prints, slipped under my door, grainy shots of the pond, the hills, that pale thing half submerged. No note, no explanation, just there, waiting for me. I'd chuck M, but more came, every few days, like clockwork. My buddy Jack saw one, laughed, said I'd staged it for clout. I didn't tell him the truth, how those empty eyes haunted me, how the air got cold when I held them. It was disturbing as hell, and I was too stubborn to admit I was scared stiff. My mistake was keeping one. Found it under my couch one night. Sharpest yet, that thing staring straight at the lens, teeth bared. I should have burned it, but I didn't. Tucked it in a drawer, thinking I'd figure it out later. Dumbass move. That night, I woke to dripping, steady, loud, from the kitchen. Stumbled out, flipped the light, and saw it. Water pouring from the drawer, dark and thick, pooling across the floor. My chest locked up. I yanked it open, and the photo was gone, just a wet smear where it had been. Then the shadow moved. Corner of my eye, by the window, tall, wet, hunched like it had been waiting. I spun, and there it was, pressed against the glass, 3 stories up. Those cracked glass eyes bored into me, and that hiss filled the room, rattling my bones. I grabbed a bat, swung wild, but it didn't flinch, just leaned closer, water streaking down the pane. I ran, crashed at Jax's place, babbling about ghosts. He thought I'd cracked, and maybe I had. But it wasn't my head. It was real, and I'd invited it in. I tried everything after that. Salt, sage, some half-assed prayer I Googled. Nothing stopped it. Saw it in alleys, on rooftops, always dripping, always watching. Last week, I found scratches on my door, deep, jagged, like that tree in the hills. My ankle's still busted from the escape, slowing me down, and I'm running out of moves. Friends think I'm losing it. Gigs dried up 'cause I can't hold a camera steady. It's a tragedy, man. I'm trapped, and it's my fault for keeping that damn photo. Last night, I saw it inside. Kitchen, just standing there, water spreading across the tiles. Didn't chase, just stared, like it's waiting for me to break. I'm writing this now, scribbling fast, 'cause I don't know how long I've got. If you're near Boston, the Blue Hills, and you see water where it shouldn't be, or hear that scrape, run. Don't take pics, don't keep souvenirs. I did, and now I'm marked, drowning in this mess one drip at a time. I hear it now. Hiss in the hall, wet steps closing in. I'm not sure I'll finish this page. If you find it, don't look for me. Just burn it, burn everything, and get the hell out. This isn't just a story, it's my end, and it's coming fast. I never go to Boston again. My name's Tatum Reese Holloway, 35 years old, born and bred in the dusty sprawl of Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm a line cook, grease-stained apron, calloused hands, always smelling faintly of onions and smoked meat. I've got a restless streak a mile wide, so I save up my tips and hit the road whenever I can. Just me and my Chevrolet Silverado. It's a beast, dented and loud, but it's mine, and it's hauled me through more miles than I can count. This time, I was chasing a break from the heat and the grind. Boston wasn't my first pick. I'd been aiming for the coast, Maine, maybe, with its rocky shores and lobster shacks, but a regular at the diner wouldn't shut up about Massachusetts. Said the camping near Boston was raw, real, with history you could feel in your bones. I'd never been, so I thought, why not? Packed my cooler with cheap beer and burgers, tossed my tent in the back, and drove east, radio cranked to Johnny Cash. Figured I'd find some quiet, cook over a fire, and shake off Tulsa's dust. The trip took 2 days, me weaving through back roads 'cause highways bore me stiff. Boston hit me like a slap. Tight streets, old stone, that salty harbor tang sneaking in. I didn't linger. Cities aren't my thing unless I'm flipping patties in M. I'd scoped out Harold Parker State Forest, just north of the city, woods, ponds, a slice of wild close enough to dip into town if I got antsy. Rolled in late afternoon, sun slanting through the pines, and picked a spot near Berry Pond, far from the main sights. Felt like home, almost. Setting up was easy. Tin up, fire pit dug, cooler cracked open. I'm no fancy camper. Grew up sleeping in fields when the trailer got too hot, but I know my way around a fire. Burgers sizzled, beer fizzed, and I kicked back, boots off, watching the flames lick the dusk. The forest was alive with chirps and rustles, a nice change from Tulsa's cicada drone. I grinned, thinking I'd nailed it. Peace, quiet, a little corner of nowhere to call mine for a few days. Man, was I clueless. You ever feel like a place is too still? Not dead, just waiting? I got that itch as the sun dipped, shadows stretching long across the pond. Brushed it off. Too many late shifts, not enough sleep. I've cooked through storms, dodged bar brawls, never spooked easy. But out here, something nagged me. Maybe it was the stories I'd heard. Boston's got a rep for weird, old tales of lost souls and cursed ground. Back home, we've got our own legends, ghosts of oil rigs, twisters with minds of their own, but I always laughed them off. I decided to stretch my legs, wandered down to the pond with a beer in hand. Water was dark, reflecting the last light like a mirror. Tossed a rock in, watched the ripples spread, and that's when I saw it. Something floating, just under the surface, pale and long. Fish, I figured, or trash. Took a swig, squinted, and it was gone. Chuckled to myself, city girl getting jumpy over nothing. But the ripples kept going, bigger, like something was pushing back. My grin faded a touch. Back at camp, I stoked the fire, settled in with another beer. Night closed in fast, stars punching through the trees. I'm used to being alone, prefer it, even, but that quiet started feeling heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. I shook it off, crawled into my tent, and zipped up tight. Figured I'd wake up to birds and coffee, maybe fish the pond if I got ambitious. That's how it should have gone. But as I drifted off, I heard it, a splash, sharp and close, like something big hitting the water. Rolled over, told myself it was a deer. Yeah, right. Sleep didn't come easy after that. Kept picturing that pale thing in the pond, the way the ripples moved wrong. I'm not one for ghost stories. Give me a skillet and a stove. I'm good, but that splash stuck with me, nagging like a bad burn. Whatever it was out there, and I had no clue it had already clocked me as its next problem. I woke up to a crick in my neck and a tent that smelled like damp socks. Fire was out, ashes soggy, like someone doused it while I slept. No rain, though sky was clear when I poked my head out, all pale blue and mocking me. That splash from last night lingered in my head, but I shook it off, blaming a clumsy critter. I'm a cook, not a conspiracy nut. Give me a spatula over a tinfoil hat any day. Stumbled over to my cooler, cracked a warm beer for breakfast, and figured I'd get the day rolling. The pond was calling, so I grabbed my fishing rod, cheap thing I'd snagged at a Tulsa pawn shop, and trudged down. Water was still, too still, like it was daring me to mess with it. I cast a line, sat on a rock, and waited. Nothing bit. Not a nibble, not a ripple. I fished back home, muddy creeks full of catfish, and I know when water's dead. This wasn't just quiet, it was empty, and that started gnawing at me. I reeled in, muttering about bad luck, when I saw it again. Something pale, drifting just under the surface, gone before I could blink. I stood up fast, rod clattering on the rock. My gut twisted, that old cook's instinct when the kitchen's about to go sideways. I've seen weird, drunk-line cooks swearing they saw Elvis in the grease trap, but this felt off, scary even. Told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a log or some pondweed. But as I headed back to camp, I noticed the mud, my boot prints from last night, sure, but others too. Long, thin tracks, like someone dragged a broom through the dirt, leading from the water to my tent. My beer went sour in my mouth. Back at the site, I checked my setup. Tent stakes were loose, cooler lid cracked open. Not enough to raid, just enough to mess with me. I've camped plenty, coyotes, wind, even a tornado once, but this wasn't nature's doing. Felt personal, like someone poked around just to screw with my head. I tightened the stakes, kicked the cooler shut, and decided to hike it out. Harold Parker's got trails galore. Figured fresh air might shake the heebie-jeebies. Packed a burger and my knife, just in case, and hit the path. The woods were thick, pines clawing at the sky, and the trail wound tight around the pond. I kept glancing at the water, half expecting that pale thing to pop up. Nothing, just that dead stillness. Then I found a tree, big maple, bark peeled back in strips, not cut, torn, like something clawed it raw. Sap oozed, fresh and sticky, and the air around it stank. Wet, sour, not like any forest smell I know. I've smelled burnt grease and spoiled meat. This was worse, disturbing in a way that stuck to you. Kept hiking, but the trail got weird. Markers faded, paths splitting off into nowhere. My phone was useless, no signal, battery draining fast, even though I'd charged it in Tulsa. I'm no rookie, grew up finding my way through Oklahoma storms, but this place was messing with me, looping me back toward the pond no matter which way I turned. By noon, I was sweaty, pissed, and ready to call it. Headed back to camp, figuring I'd pack up early, hit a Boston dive bar instead. Solo camping's great, till it turns on you, right? Got back and froze. My fire pit was gone, not scattered, gone. Just a hole in the dirt, rocks missing, like someone scooped it out. The tent was still up, but the flap was unzipped, fluttering like I'd left it open. I hadn't. My knife came out, gripped tight, and I scanned the trees. Nothing moved, but that sour stink was back, heavier now, curling up from the pond. I faced down rowdy drunks with cleavers. This was scarier, a quiet threat I couldn't clock. I stood there, debating, stay and figure it out, or bounce. Tulsa grit said stay, common sense said go. I compromised, decided to poke around the pond one last time, see if I could spot whatever was screwing with me. Grabbed a stick, marched down, and started jabbing the shallows. Water stayed dead, but then I heard it, a low gurgle, not from the pond, from behind me. Spun around, stick raised, and saw the trees shift, like something big was easing through. My heart kicked up, and I knew I'd just stirred some serious trouble. That gurgle behind me stopped me dead, stick still raised like some half-assed weapon. I turned slow, eyes locked on the trees, and the air went thick, wet, heavy, like I'd stepped into a steam bath. I've cooked through Tulsa summers, sweat dripping into the fryer, but this was different, suffocating. The gurgle came again, deeper, rolling out from the pines, and my gut screamed trouble. I'm no coward, flipped burgers through bar fights, but this was horror creeping in, and I wasn't ready. Then it stepped out. Not fast, not sneaky, just there, at the edge of the woods, maybe 20 feet off. Tall, hunched, draped in something dark and sodden, like a tarp left in the rain too long. Water dripped from it, steady, pooling in the dirt, and its head tilted, showing me a face I wish I'd never seen. Pale, stretched tight, eyes like cloudy marbles, mouth gaping with teeth sharp and wrong. My stick dropped, hands went numb, and I swear I felt that gurgle in my bones, scary as hell and twice as real. It didn't move, just stared, dripping, while that sour stink hit me full on, rotten, alive, like a dumpster behind a fish joint. I've smelled bad, week-old grease traps, roadkill on Route 66, but this was personal, clawing down my throat. I took a step back, boots squelching, and it twitched, head snapping straight like it had heard me think. The pond behind me rippled, loud now, and I glanced back. Big mistake. Something pale flashed under the water, fast, circling like a shark. My heart slammed, terror locking my knees. I yelled, "Back off." Dumb. Yeah, but it felt good to make noise. Voice cracked, echoing off the trees, and that thing answered with a hiss, wet and sharp, like steam off a hot grill. It shuffled forward, slow, dragging one leg, water trailing behind it like a leash. I bolted for camp, legs shaky, mind blank except for one word: run. I've dodged angry drunks swinging bottles. This was worse, a nightmare I couldn't punch my way out of. The gurgle chased me, bouncing through the woods, closing in. Hit my sight and tripped over the cooler, burgers spilling into the mud. Tent was still up, flap wide, and I dove for my knife. Left it by the fire pit that wasn't there anymore. Found it half buried in the dirt, snatched it up, and spun around. It was closer now, weaving through the trees, head low like it was sniffing me out. The hiss turned into a growl, low and wet, and I saw its hands. Long, bony, nails like bent forks, clawing the air. My camp felt like a trap, and I was the damn bait. I backed toward the trail, knife out, sweat stinging my eyes. The pond roared. Yeah, roared, waves slapping the bank like a storm hit. Looked over, and there were more, pale shapes under the water, thrashing, breaking the surface with hands and heads. All wrong, all watching. My brain shorted out. Boston's got stories, cursed ponds, dead things that don't stay down. I'd laughed at him over beers. Not laughing now. This was disturbing, a full-on terror show, and I was center stage. I swung the knife, wild, yelling again to keep my nerve. Stay back, you freaks. It didn't flinch, just kept coming, slow and sure, water spreading around it like a shadow. I turned and ran, full sprint, crashing through brush, thorns tearing at my jeans. The growl followed, joined by splashes, wet thuds, like the pond was emptying out after me. I hit a clearing, lungs on fire, and saw it. Another figure, same pale mess, blocking the trail ahead. Trapped, surrounded, and no clue how they'd boxed me in. Panic took over. I veered off, dodging trees, aiming for any gap I could find. My boot caught mud, slid, and I went down hard, knife flying into the weeds. Scrambled up, hands slick, and heard it. Right behind me. That hiss so close I felt the damp on my neck. Spun around, fists up, and it was there, looming, eyes glinting like dirty ice. No time to think. Just swung, fist connecting with something soft and cold. It hissed louder, staggered, and I booked it, praying for a road, a miracle, anything to get me out of this hell. I ran blind, fist still clenched from that swing, legs pumping like I could outpace my own heartbeat. The woods blurred, pines whipping past, mud sucking at my boots, but that hiss stayed glued to me, wet and close. I've hauled ass from Tulsa storms, tornado sirens blaring, but this was a life and death chase, pure horror driving me forward. My knife was gone, lost in the weeds, and my lungs burned like I'd swallowed hot grease. No looking back, just run, Tatum, run. The growl split into two, then three, more of M, fanning out through the trees. I caught glimpses, pale shapes weaving, water trailing behind like they were bleeding the pond dry. My mind spun. Get out, get high, get anywhere but here. The trail was toast, swallowed by brush, so I crashed through, thorns ripping my arms bloody. That sour stink clung to me, thick now, and the air turned cold, damp, like I was running through a freezer. I'd take a bar brawl over this terror any day. Then the ground dropped. Steep slope, slick with leaves. I slipped, rolled, hit roots and rocks till I slammed into a creek bed. Water splashed, ice cold, soaking me through. I scrambled up, gasping, and saw it. Road, maybe 100 yards off, headlights flickering through the trees. Hope's a hell of a spark. I bolted for it, ankles screaming from the fall. Behind me, the hisses merged, loud and pissed, and I heard splashes, big ones, like they'd hit the creek too. No time to check, just go. Halfway there, the water moved. Not the creek, something under it, fast, cutting toward me. A hand broke the surface, pale, bony, nails like hooks, and grabbed my leg. I yelled, kicked hard, boot connecting with something soft that didn't give. It let go, but the pull came again, stronger, dragging me back. I clawed the bank, mud in my nails, and kicked till my heel hit bone. Free, barely. I stumbled up, wet and wild, and sprinted for the road, that growl roaring in my ears. Headlights blinded me as I burst out, arms flailing like a lunatic. A horn blared, tires screeched, a delivery van, skidding to a stop. The driver, some kid with a scruffy beard, leaned out, yelling, "You trying to die?" I didn't answer, just yanked the passenger door, threw myself in, and croaked, "Drive, now." He gaped, but floored it, gravel spitting behind us. I twisted, peering out the back. Trees swallowed the creek, but I saw him, 3 shapes, standing at the edge, water pooling, watching me go. The kid rambled, something about crazy hikers, late deliveries, but I tuned him out, chest heaving, staring at my hands. Mud, blood, shaking like I'd just plated a rush order from hell. The road curved, forest fading, and I thought maybe I'd made it. Then the rear view caught my eye, water dripping from the seat, dark and slow, pooling on the floor. My gut dropped. I hadn't tracked that in. I was soaked, sure, but not like that. The kid didn't notice, kept yapping, but I felt it. Something scary wasn't done with me. He dropped me at a gas station off 128, neon buzzing, air thick with diesel. I stumbled in, bought a coffee with coins I dug from my pocket, and sat under the harsh lights, shivering. Folks stared, muddy cook, wild-eyed, reeking of pond rot, but I didn't care. I'd escaped, barely, a heartbeat from being dragged under. Thought I'd left it behind, that those things couldn't follow. Wrong. As I sipped, the cup slipped. My hands were wet, not from sweat, from water seeping out of my sleeves, cold and alive. I bolted to the bathroom, checked the mirror, face scratched, eyes hollow, and behind me, a flicker. Not clear, just a smudge, pale and wet, gone when I blinked. My breath caught. I'd punched it, run from it, but it had tagged along, quiet now, waiting. The kid's VIN was gone, road empty, and I stood there, coffee cold, knowing this wasn't over. I'd dodged the big danger, sure, but something disturbing had hitched a ride, and I was still in its grip. I stood in that gas station bathroom, staring at the mirror till my eyes burned, waiting for that smudge to flicker back. Nothing, just my scratched-up face, looking like I'd lost a fight with a blender. The water dripping from my sleeve slowed, but it left a puddle on the tile, dark and still. I've cooked through chaos, grease fires, screaming managers, but this horror stuck to me, heavy and cold. Wiped my hands, splashed my face, and bolted back to the counter, figuring coffee and light might keep me sane. They didn't. Hitched a ride to Tulsa the next day with a trucker hauling cattle. Stank worse than me, which was saying something. Crashed at my place, a cramped rental off 11th Street, and tried to scrub Boston off me. Showered till the hot water quit, burned my clothes in a barrel out back. Thought I could outrun it, bury it in work, flipping burgers, cracking beers with the crew. First night, I slept hard, dreaming of mud and hisses. Woke up to wet sheets, not sweat, water seeping up from the mattress. My stomach sank. It didn't stop there. Puddles showed up, kitchen floor, under my couch. Always cold, always sour, like that pond had followed me home. I mopped them up, cussed loud, but they kept coming. Then the noises, gurgles, low and wet, echoing from the pipes. I've lived in dives, roaches, leaky faucets, but this was scary, personal. Told my buddy Cal over beers. He laughed, said I'd smoked too much. Didn't tell him about the mirror, how I'd catch that pale flicker behind me, gone when I turned. My mistake was the photo. Found it in my wallet a week later. Crumpled Polaroid I didn't take, me by the pond, grinning like an idiot. Behind me, blurry but there, that thing, tall, dripping, eyes like marbles. I'd swear I never snapped it. My camera was back in Tulsa the whole trip. Should have torched it right then, but I didn't. Stupid cook's curiosity. Tucked it in a drawer, thinking I'd deal with it later. That night, the gurgle hit loud, right outside my bedroom door, and water seeped under, spreading fast. I grabbed a bat, heart hammering, and yanked the door open. Hall was empty, but the air was wet, stinking, and the drawer rattled like something was clawing out. I ran to it, pulled it free. The photo was gone, just a wet smear, and the gurgle turned to a hiss, close now. Spun around, and there it was, corner of the room, hunched, dripping, staring at me with that jagged grin. I swung the bat, hit nothing but wall, and it just stood there, water pooling, spreading toward my bare feet. I bailed, ran barefoot through Tulsa streets, neighbors yelling, dogs losing it. Crashed at Cal's, babbling about monsters. He sobered me up, said I'd snapped. Stress, maybe PTSD from a bad trip. I let him think it, but I knew better. That thing wasn't in my head. It was here, tied to that photo I'd kept. Tried salt, holy water, shit I saw in movies, nothing worked. Saw it in the alley, on my roof, always dripping, always waiting. My ankles still busted from the fall, slowing me down, and I'm slipping. Last night it got in. Kitchen, standing by the sink, water pouring from its mouth like a busted tap. Didn't move, just watched me grab my keys and run. I'm at a diner now, scribbling this on napkins, hands shaking so bad I can barely write. Folks stare, muddy cook, wild-eyed, reeking of fear, but I don't care. It's a tragedy, man. I punched it, ran from it, but keeping that photo dragged it home. I'm marked, and it's closing in. Hear it now, drip outside, hiss in the air. Napkins are wet, ink smearing. If you find this, don't look for me. Burn it, burn everything, and stay the hell out of Harold Parker. I didn't, and now I'm done, drowning in this mess one step at a time. Doors creaking, it's here. Gotta go. I wish I'd never agreed to come here in the first place. My name's Bradley James Harlow. I'm 29 years old, and I grew up in a small suburb near Denver. A couple weeks back, I decided to pack up my Chevrolet Silverado and head out to Boston for a camping trip that was supposed to be a total escape from my everyday worries. The plan sounded fun. Drive east, see the sights, and meet up with an old friend who knew some good camping spots outside the city. But right now, I can't shake this awful feeling that I made the biggest mistake of my life. Every time I close my eyes, I see flashes of everything that happened, and it's haunting me in a way that's downright disturbing. It all started off normal enough. I left Denver before sunrise, feeling excited and pumped for a change of scenery. figuring a road trip would be just what I needed to break away from my routine. The drive was peaceful until I hit the outskirts of Boston, where traffic got thicker and my nerves kicked in. Boston's older architecture made me feel like I'd stepped back in time, and I caught myself daydreaming about the city's deep history and hidden secrets. Part of me loved the vibe. There's something thrilling about big city energy mixed with that classic New England atmosphere. But at the same time, there was this eerie undercurrent that I couldn't quite place. That tiny knot in my stomach felt like a warning I should have listened to, but I just shook it off and pressed on. Once I reconnected with my buddy, he insisted we camp near a wooded area just beyond the city limits. To be honest, I wasn't exactly sure where we were going, but I was too excited to ask a lot of questions. It felt like an adventure, something out of a road trip movie, minus the cheesy soundtrack. We stocked up on supplies and grabbed a bite at this rundown diner where the waitress seemed more than happy to share local ghost stories. She went on about rumored hauntings and places locals avoided after dark. I laughed it off at the time, but there was this split second when her eyes narrowed and she whispered that some roads are better left untraveled. It was a small comment, but the uneasy hush in the diner made my spine tingle in a scary kind of way. I wish I could say that was the only ominous sign, but more hints kept popping up. Random townsfolk would shoot us these worried looks, and at a gas station, the old cashier asked if we had a death wish by camping so far from civilization. My friend just brushed it off as local superstition, like how some communities thrive on tall tales and horror legends. At first, I believed him. Maybe folks just wanted to spook the out-of-towners, hoping we'd steer clear of their land. But the longer I stayed, the more I sensed that these weren't just silly old stories. Something disturbing seemed to hover over that entire stretch of road, like a constant whisper in the wind telling us we didn't belong. When we finally found a suitable campsite, we set up our tents and tried to relax. The forest around us felt oddly quiet, broken only by the rustle of leaves and occasional animal calls. At sundown, the trees took on these twisted shapes that played tricks on my mind. I convinced myself I was just being paranoid, but it's hard to ignore the sense of being watched. We built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and tried to joke around, yet I couldn't fully shake the tension crawling up my neck. It was a raw kind of fear, like my instincts knew something was off long before my brain could piece it together. Even the air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the very atmosphere was warning me to leave. I remember trying to distract myself with small talk, asking my friend about his life in Boston, the new gigs he'd taken, the city's nightlife. He told me about local clubs and trendy bars, but I kept drifting back to what we were doing out here, away from everything familiar. At one point, he revealed that he'd heard rumors about this place, strange disappearances, and unexplained lights in the woods at night. He said it was probably nothing, just the kind of scary folklore locals pass around for fun. But the way he avoided eye contact when he mentioned it made my stomach flip. I could see he wasn't entirely convinced it was all make-believe, and neither was I. The moment that truly sent chills through me was when we heard a distant sound that didn't fit with the usual forest noises. It was faint, like a person crying, but with a note of desperation that made it impossible to ignore. We both froze, peering into the darkness, hearts pounding as we tried to figure out if it was just an echo or a trick of the wind. The fire crackled between us, casting long, dancing shadows that felt ominous, almost menacing. My mind raced with questions. Was someone out there, lost or hurt? Or was it something else altogether? My friend tried to act brave, but I could see he was just as spooked as I was, his hands trembling slightly when he reached for a flashlight. At that point, the camping trip took on a whole new tone. Every step I took, every breath I drew, felt magnified by this growing tension. I felt a surge of regret, wishing I'd never come so far from home. And yet, some strange curiosity also flared up inside me, compelling me to see what lay beyond the dark tree line. I couldn't decide whether to pack up and leave right then or explore more deeply, hoping to prove my nerves were just playing tricks on me. That choice, however, would become a turning point I'd never forget, leading me to the most disturbing experience of my life. I woke up the next morning with a heavy feeling in my chest, like my body already sensed something wasn't right. My friend Gideon was standing by the dying embers of our campfire, poking at the ashes with a stick. He flashed me a nervous grin and mumbled something about how we must have imagined that weird crying sound during the night. Deep down, I knew neither of us really believed it was just our imagination, but we tried to convince ourselves anyway. It's strange how the mind works in scary situations. You start bargaining with logic just to calm down for a second. We ate a quick breakfast, though neither of us had much of an appetite, and decided to explore the surrounding woods a bit more. Partly to prove we weren't losing our minds, and partly to see if anyone needed help. We wandered deeper into the forest, stepping over tangled roots and pushing aside low-hanging branches. Each step felt like it carried me further away from safety, as if the undergrowth itself wanted to swallow me whole. I kept glancing back to see if I could still spot the thin trail we'd followed, nervous about getting lost. My heart hammered in my chest every time a branch snapped underfoot or a bird fluttered out of a nearby bush. Gideon tried to crack jokes, and I forced a few laughs, but there was this unsettling tension hanging in the air. Even the sunlight filtering through the leaves seemed dimmer, which fueled my sense of dread. I swear, every rustle or shadow made me think of something disturbing lurking just out of sight. We eventually came across a small clearing where the grass was matted down in a way that suggested someone, or something, had been there. I crouched and ran my fingers over the flattened blades, noticing a faint red stain at the edge. It could have been berry juice, or maybe paint, but my mind instantly jumped to darker possibilities. Gideon looked as uneasy as I felt, his eyes darting around while his hands fidgeted at his sides. In that moment, a choice hovered in front of us like a crossroads in a horror movie. Should we dig deeper, or get the heck out of there? The sensible part of me wanted to run back to camp, pack up, and never look back. But some stubborn curiosity kept me rooted to the spot, determined to find out what was really going on. That's when we heard it again, the faint sound of crying. This time it was closer, echoing through the trees with a heartbreaking tone that made my arms break out in goosebumps. Gideon and I exchanged a look that spoke volumes about how scared we were, but also about how we couldn't just ignore someone who might be hurt or in danger. Against our better judgment, we decided to follow the noise, navigating through dense patches of thorns that tugged at our clothes. Each crackling step felt like it was giving away our position to whatever might be out there. My heart thudded so loudly I could barely hear my own thoughts over the pounding rush of blood in my ears. We pushed our way through some overgrown bushes, and the crying suddenly stopped. This silence was even more unnerving, like a collective inhale before something truly terrifying happens. I tried to call out, "Hello? Are you okay?" But my voice wavered, betraying my nerves. No answer, no movement, just the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant call of a crow. A wave of dread washed over me. What if someone, or something, was watching us right now, deciding whether to reveal itself? In that split second, it felt like the forest turned into a living entity with a twisted sense of humor, playing a cruel game to keep us guessing. That sense of being a pawn in a disturbing setup made me shiver. Eventually, we decided we weren't going to find whoever was making that noise by wandering aimlessly, so we retraced our steps. The path back to our camp was somehow more tense than before, as though the woods were whispering behind our backs. Every distant crack or snap made us jump. We talked in hushed tones, agreeing we should reevaluate our plan. The question was, do we stay another night out here, hoping we can ignore all these red flags, or should we get in the truck and drive until the forest is just a bad memory in the rearview mirror? I could tell Gideon wanted to prove he wasn't afraid, but I'd never felt so small and vulnerable. Each minute in that creepy atmosphere felt heavier than the last. When we made it back, our campsite looked almost too normal in the daylight, as if it were mocking our fright. Yet something had changed. A bundle of sticks was neatly piled near the fire pit, though we hadn't collected any fresh firewood. The realization that someone, or something, had been wandering around our camp while we were gone shot a cold thrill of horror through me. Maybe it was a friendly gesture, or maybe it was a warning. Our nerves were already rattled, and finding that little present just tipped us further into suspicion. We scanned the tree line for any sign of movement, but it felt like we were being watched from every angle, with the forest hiding countless secrets. By this point, the problems were obvious. Unexplained noises, ominous signs, and a growing sense that our presence here was unwelcome. We had decisions to make. Gideon and I talked it through, debating if we should pack up and head back into Boston city limits. But we're stubborn idiots sometimes, and we convinced ourselves that maybe we'd overreacted. Maybe the weird sounds were just an animal in distress, and maybe the sticks were dropped off by a passing hiker who meant well. Nothing truly scary had happened, right? That's what we told ourselves, clinging to any shred of logic to calm the nerves. But deep down, we both knew we were crossing into unknown territory, and the next sign might not be so easy to explain away. That evening, we tried to act like everything was normal, but the vibe around camp was way off. The sunset felt heavier than usual, throwing long shadows across the ground that made the woods look almost haunted. Gideon tried to spark up conversation about the Red Sox, hoping to lighten the mood, but neither of us could ignore the tension that hung like a fog. After gathering more firewood and constantly checking over our shoulders, we settled in for the night. Our plan was to keep the fire going as long as possible, hoping its glow would keep away anything scary lurking among the trees. The thing is, fear doesn't really follow logic. Even with the flames dancing, I still felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. It was sometime after midnight when I caught the first glimpse of something moving beyond the reach of the firelight. My breath caught in my throat as I strained my eyes, trying to figure out if it was just a branch swaying in the breeze or an actual person creeping around. Gideon must have seen it too because he tensed up next to me, holding his flashlight like a weapon. We sat there in silence, practically trembling, until a low rustling sound made us jump to our feet. It was so disturbing that my instincts told me to run, but my curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. Part of me thought it might be some wild animal, but the shape was all wrong. Too tall, too human. We slowly approached the edge of the campsite, hearts hammering in our chests. Gideon aimed his flashlight around, revealing nothing but trees and shadows, but I swear I heard a quick shuffle, like footsteps trying to stay quiet. I yelled out, "Hey, whoever's out there, we're armed," even though we really weren't. No response, not even the smallest crunch of leaves. It was like the night had swallowed up whoever, or whatever, was lurking around. We looked at each other, this sharp realization creeping in that we might not be alone. The thought sent a wave of horror rolling through me. Suddenly, all the local legends and cryptic warnings felt all too real, and I wondered if we'd just sealed our fate by staying. Not long after we sat back down by the fire, trying to calm our nerves, we heard an unmistakable thump against the side of Gideon's tent. We froze, glancing at each other in alarm before jumping to our feet again. My heart pounded so loud I could barely think straight, and I could tell Gideon was rattled too. We moved closer, flashlights twitching across the tent's surface, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. No footprints, no claw marks, nothing that made logical sense. Yet we couldn't deny something had definitely hit the canvas. At that moment, my gut told me that if we stayed put much longer, we'd be making the biggest mistake of our lives. The scariest part, though, was the realization that all the noises and odd sightings felt like they were ramping up, as if something was testing our resolve. We'd seen horror movies where the main characters ignore the warning signs until it's too late, and suddenly, I felt like I was living out one of those disturbing plots. The longer we stayed, the more convinced I became that this wasn't just a random person messing with us. There was an intent behind these events, a sense of being watched and toyed with. I tried to crack a joke about us starring in our own twisted campfire story, but even I could hear the shaky edge in my voice. As the hours crawled by, the fire started to burn low, and a tense silence settled over the campsite. Every time the flames crackled, I jumped, half expecting a figure to appear right at the edge of the light. In my head, I replayed the conversations we had at that diner, the waitress warning us about roads best left untraveled, and the old cashier who acted like we were signing our own death warrants by coming out here. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, forming a picture of a nightmare we might not be able to wake up from. I found myself whispering to Gideon that we should bail, but he shook his head, insisting we hold on until morning when it'd be safer to navigate back to civilization. At one point, I heard that same cry from before, but this time it was closer, like it was right behind the tree line, pleading for help. Without thinking, I hopped up, shining my flashlight wildly into the darkness, my pulse pounding in my ears. For a moment, I considered running straight into the forest again, but Gideon gripped my arm and shook his head. He was right. It felt like bait, a trap set to lure us deeper. The cry died out just as quickly as it started, leaving an echo of hopelessness behind. I sat back down, heart hammering, feeling more helpless than ever. The real terror was the sense that we were in a game we never agreed to play, with rules we couldn't possibly understand. We spent the rest of the night huddled by the dwindling fire, too scared to sleep, jumping at every noise. Each crack of a twig or rustle of leaves felt like a potential threat, a sign that something was circling us. The forest itself seemed alive with malicious intent, closing in around us. I'll be honest, I've never felt that kind of raw, primal fear before, like the world had become some twisted stage for a nightmare. When dawn finally started to break, I caught myself almost crying in relief, thinking that maybe daylight would chase away the horrors of the night. Of course, I had no idea that the terror was just getting started and that things were about to escalate in ways I couldn't even imagine. Morning light brought a tiny sliver of hope, but the moment I crawled out of my tent, I felt how fragile that hope really was. I glanced at Gideon, who was rubbing his eyes like he'd barely slept. We both looked like we'd aged a decade overnight. The plan had been to pack up and leave, no questions asked, but it turned out we'd gotten ourselves into a spot where just leaving wasn't that simple. The truck, which we'd parked along a narrow dirt road, was still a short walk away through thick underbrush, and every step in that forest felt like a gamble. Still, we told ourselves that once we reached it, we could drive until Boston's skyline was in sight, ignoring any weird looks we'd get for hauling camping gear at sunrise. It was the smartest move we could imagine. Get away from this disturbing place as fast as possible. We gathered our stuff in a hurry, eyes constantly flicking to the tree-line. My hands shook while rolling up the tent, partly from fatigue, partly from that lingering fear someone, or something, was watching. Every small sound made us jump. A distant crack or rustle would send our eyes darting, half expecting to see a figure peering at us from behind a tree. Gideon tried to lighten the mood by reminding me of the greasy diner food we'd reward ourselves with once we got back to town, but even that plan felt like a far-off fantasy. My gut tightened every time I remembered the crying and the shadowy figure from last night. It was like we'd walked into a nightmare and were now scrambling to wake up. When we finally started trekking back to the truck, the forest seemed darker than it should have in broad daylight. The canopy overhead was dense, blocking out the sun's warmth and making the path feel eerie. I couldn't shake the suspicion that we were being herded, as though the woods had a mind of its own, guiding us in some twisted way. About halfway there, Gideon suddenly stopped dead in his tracks, and I almost bumped into him. He pointed at the ground, and I saw fresh footprints, human ones, but not ours. They led off the path, weaving into the deeper brush. Seeing them confirmed we really weren't alone, and for the first time, I felt a jolt of genuine panic. This wasn't just some ghost story or creepy legend. It was real. Despite every instinct screaming at us to ignore the footprints and keep moving, Gideon whispered that we should at least see where they led. He argued that if someone else was out here, maybe they were in trouble, or worse, maybe they were the reason for the horrifying events of the night. My brain was in full flight mode, but a small part of me agreed it might be safer to know who was lurking in the woods. So we made a split-second decision that, in hindsight, might have been a massive mistake. We followed those prints, stepping carefully, as if one wrong move would trigger some unspeakable horror. Each footfall felt like an invitation for disaster. A voice in my head kept saying, "This is exactly how people end up missing on the news." We didn't have to walk far. In a small clearing, we found a makeshift campsite, if you can even call it that. It was more like a scattered arrangement of junk, old tarps, a dented cooler, and a half-collapsed tent that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The whole setup radiated a disturbing vibe, like something horrible had happened here. The silence pressed in on us, heavier than any I'd ever experienced. My pulse thundered in my ears as I spotted what looked like personal belongings, a torn backpack, a single battered shoe, and, most chilling of all, a piece of cloth stained with something dark that I prayed wasn't blood. Gideon crouched to pick up a faded photograph from the ground. It showed a smiling couple, arms wrapped around each other in front of a waterfall. Whoever they were, they definitely weren't here now. That's when everything went sideways. From somewhere behind us came a sudden crash, like someone, or something, had just barreled through the undergrowth. Gideon whipped around, flashlight at the ready even though it was daytime. Fear took over, sending adrenaline surging through my veins. Without a word, we both scrambled back toward the main path, our breath ragged as we practically dove through the thicket. We didn't look back. We didn't want to see what was chasing us. Branches slapped against my arms and face, but I didn't stop. A sense of pure terror pulsed inside me, and I remember thinking, this is how people end up on those missing campers reports, vanished without a trace in a place like this. We burst onto the narrow dirt road and spotted the truck, our lifeline, just a few yards away. Relief hit me so hard I almost collapsed. But, in our scramble, I noticed the driver's side window was cracked open, which was odd because I remembered locking everything up. My mind started racing, picturing some lunatic hiding inside, or the engine sabotaged. Still, there was no time to hesitate. We reached the doors, threw our gear in the back, and Gideon fired up the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I nearly sobbed from the pure joy of it. Before I could even fasten my seatbelt, we were peeling out, gravel spraying behind us like we were fleeing from the devil itself. Speeding down that rough dirt path, branches scraping against the sides, I couldn't help but picture all the horror we were leaving behind. The campsite, the footprints, the half-heard sobs in the night. Everything felt like a puzzle we'd only begun to piece together. 1,000 questions whirled through my head, but survival took priority. My heart still pounded with the realization that we were caught in something way bigger than we could handle. And as the road opened up to the main highway, I thought we were finally escaping, clueless that our brush with danger was far from over. The highway stretched ahead, and I thought our troubles might finally be over, but my relief was short-lived. As we left the dense forest behind, a sense of unease still lingered, like we'd taken something dark with us. Gideon and I barely spoke, trying to process what we'd just gone through. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, sweat collecting at my temples. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a twisted figure sprinting after us. Or worse, something lurking in the back seat. It felt weird to be in the daylight again, surrounded by other cars, because my mind was stuck in that disturbing night. Even the radio chatter sounded distant, like I was underwater. We pulled into a near-empty parking lot on the outskirts of Boston to regroup. The city skyline rose in the distance, a reminder that normal life still existed, but I couldn't shake the notion that what we'd been through had changed us. Gideon hopped out, pacing circles around the truck, exhaling shaky breaths, as if he were trying to wake up from a bad dream. I opened the door and stepped onto the asphalt, half wondering if the ground would swallow me whole. Finally, we managed to piece together what we'd do next. Find a cheap motel, lay low, and figure out how to report what we'd seen, if we even should report it. Part of me feared the police would laugh us off, or, worse, find evidence that proved how much danger we'd been in. At the motel, we tried to act like two buddies on a routine trip, but the clerk must have seen how rattled we were. She raised an eyebrow, handed us a key, and mentioned that Boston had its own share of haunted rumors, a casual comment that made my stomach twist. Once in the room, Gideon threw himself onto the bed with a sigh that sounded like a muffled sob. I dropped my bag to the floor, mind racing as the images of that creepy campsite flooded back. The footprints, the battered shoe, the photograph with the smiling couple. My brain kept asking questions I couldn't answer. Were those people still alive? And if not, what exactly had happened to them out there? We tried to wash away the grime and the fear with scalding showers, but I still felt a grimy sense of dread clinging to my skin. The hot water couldn't cleanse my memory of that final crash in the undergrowth. It was like a locked door in my mind that refused to stay shut. Every time I blinked, I saw the twisted clearing or heard that desperate crying echo in my ears. I kept replaying how we discovered that abandoned gear, half expecting some horrifying figure to step from the shadows. Gideon tried to distract us by flipping through channels on the motel TV, sports, sitcoms, random infomercials, but none of it held our attention for long. Our real-life horror overshadowed anything the television could project. That afternoon, we debated whether we should just leave Boston altogether, drive straight back to Denver, pretend none of this ever happened, and bury these disturbing memories deep. But Gideon felt we should at least warn someone about what was going on in those woods. He worried that other unsuspecting campers might wander in and never wander out again. My head told me he was right, but my heart tightened at the idea of reliving it all by describing it to authorities. Every time I thought about calling the cops, I pictured them rolling their eyes or labeling us as attention seekers. Yet, ignoring the whole thing felt even worse, like leaving a trap set for the next victims. It was a no-win situation, and the weight of it pressed down on me. Late that night, I woke up to my phone buzzing. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but sure enough, my screen lit up with an unknown number. When I answered, the line hissed with static for a second, then went dead. I tried to call back, but there was no connection. My heart slammed against my rib cage as I stared at the blank screen. Maybe it was a wrong number, or maybe it was some cosmic coincidence. But in my tired, fear-addled mind, I couldn't help but think it was tied to everything that had happened. I couldn't shake the sense that we hadn't really escaped, that the horror had latched onto us and was just waiting for the right moment to strike again. The next morning, Gideon and I agreed we'd attempt to file a report, at least about the abandoned campsite. The detective we spoke to at the local precinct was surprisingly attentive, taking notes and asking detailed questions. But there was a look in his eyes, part skepticism, part pity, that made me realize how bizarre our story sounded. He promised to have someone look into it, and told us to stay reachable. As we walked out, I caught a glimpse of a missing persons flyer pinned to the bulletin board in the hallway. It was a blurry photo of a young woman who'd vanished on a hiking trip not too far from where we'd been. My stomach churned at the thought that we might have stumbled across signs of her fate. That same day, just when I thought the worst might be behind us, Gideon made the biggest mistake of all. He decided to go back. He said he couldn't rest until he got closure, until he at least confirmed there wasn't some poor soul still trapped out there. No amount of begging or reasoning changed his mind. He was convinced it was the right thing to do. And so, with a sick feeling of dread in my gut, I found myself faced with a choice: abandon my friend to a possibly fatal mission, or go with him and risk facing the terror we'd barely escaped. Little did I know, that decision would lead to a tragedy we'd never recover from, pulling us into a place darker than any of our worst nightmares. I wish I'd never stepped foot in these woods outside Boston. My name's Marjorie Celeste Colton. I'm 27, and I drove all the way from San Diego in my Toyota RAV4, thinking a cross-country road trip would clear my head. It's funny how a simple plan can spiral into something far more disturbing than anything I'd imagined. The moment I rolled into the city, a strange tension seemed to follow me, like a faint shadow no one else could see. I chalked it up to exhaustion from the drive, but deep down, I sensed there was more to it. Boston has that mix of modern hustle and ancient history, and I couldn't shake the feeling that behind every old brick building lay a secret no one dared to speak of. Even so, I told myself I was overthinking, that once I set up camp, I'd feel free from all the noise in my head. It started calmly enough. I spent a day or two checking out the Freedom Trail, snapping pictures of old churches and statues. But the city felt too crowded, so I decided to find a campsite beyond the suburbs, near a patch of forest locals recommended for its scenic trails. At first, the fresh air and thick canopy of leaves offered relief from the bustling streets. My phone buzzed with messages from friends asking if I was okay, and I reassured them all was well. I remember sitting by a small stream, letting the sound of water soothe my mind. If only I'd known how quickly that sense of calm would twist into something truly scary, I might have jumped back in my car and kept driving. I set up my tent near a grove of pine trees that swayed gently in the breeze, casting long shadows across the ground. I tried to embrace the solitude, but a weird shiver ran through me when I noticed how quiet it was. Normally, forests outside a big city buzz with birdsong or the rustle of small critters. Here, though, it felt like nature was holding its breath. I shrugged it off as me being jumpy. After all, I'd basically come here to escape my own racing thoughts. Still, I couldn't ignore the occasional prickling at the back of my neck, like being watched by something just beyond my sight. It gave me that faint tingle of horror I couldn't quite place. As dusk settled in, the trees turned into towering silhouettes, and the sky flared into a deep orange before darkening into shades of purple. I tried to light a campfire, messing with kindling and cursing under my breath when the flames refused to catch. At one point, I heard a distant splash in the stream and nearly dropped my lighter. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe a deer, maybe a beaver, or something else entirely. The wind picked up, carrying a faint smell of damp earth, and I reminded myself that this was supposed to be an adventure, not some disturbing ordeal I'd retell in hushed tones later. But part of me felt uneasy, like the forest was waiting for nightfall to reveal a darker side. When night finally wrapped around me, every sound seemed amplified, echoing between the trees. I started hearing odd creaks and snaps, normal forest noises, I tried to tell myself, but they felt off. Sometimes it sounded almost like footsteps, but whenever I'd shine my flashlight around, I saw nothing but branches and trunks. I tried to calm my nerves by playing music on my phone, but my battery was low, and I didn't want to risk draining it completely. A wave of loneliness hit me hard, and I found myself missing the chaos of the city. At least among crowds, you don't feel so vulnerable. Out here, under the moonlight, everything felt sharper, like the entire world was honed in on me. I tried to drift off, but my mind wouldn't let me. The slightest crunch of leaves or distant rustle had me bolting upright. The night felt downright scary, as if it had eyes of its own. At one point, a branch snapped so close that I unzipped my tent and peered into the darkness. My flashlight flickered across trees that seemed to loom like silent witnesses. No sign of animals or people, just an empty patch of woods that somehow felt crowded with unseen presence. I couldn't tell if I was imagining things or if there really was something out there, carefully staying just out of sight. That sense of being watched made my heart pound harder than I cared to admit. Eventually, sheer exhaustion forced me to doze off, but my dreams were fragmented. Images of Boston's cobblestone streets merging with shadowy forests. In one half-sleep state, I thought I heard whispering right outside my tent, a hushed voice mumbling words I couldn't understand. I jolted awake, heart thundering, but again found only silence and darkness. By the time the first hints of dawn arrived, I felt drained, my nerves raw from the tension of the night. I remember thinking, if I feel this on edge on my first night, how am I going to handle the rest of the trip? That's what set the stage for the events that would follow, some even more unnerving than the nighttime noises. It's strange how quickly fear can get under your skin and change the way you see everything around you. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a story that would challenge my sanity and drag me deeper into a terrifying mystery hidden just outside a city as lively as Boston. I woke up the next morning feeling groggy and a little on edge. The first thing I noticed was how the forest, which had seemed so peaceful before dusk, looked entirely different in the early light. My tent was damp with morning dew, and I heard faint chirps from birds trying to greet the day. But the usual sounds of a bustling woodland were oddly muted, like the place was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the thought that this quiet was unnatural, almost like nature itself was warning me to be careful. My stomach growled, reminding me I hadn't eaten a proper meal since leaving the city, so I forced myself out of my sleeping bag and tried to act like it was any normal camping trip. Deep down, the memory of last night's unsettling noises lingered, and that disturbing sense that something was off made my skin crawl. After a quick breakfast of granola bars and half-stale coffee, I decided I needed to restock on supplies and maybe get a little human contact. The isolation was already messing with my head, and I figured a short drive to a nearby town would help me regain perspective. Packing up my essentials, I tossed them into the back of the car and set off, doing my best to ignore the creeping anxiety that trailed me like a shadow. The road wound through thick clusters of trees, making it easy to imagine something scary or strange lurking behind every trunk. My heart thumped every time a branch snapped or a squirrel darted across the pavement. It felt ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the tension that had taken root deep inside me. I ended up in a small town about 15 miles from my campsite. It was one of those quaint New England spots where the main street was lined with red brick buildings and old-fashioned lampposts. A few locals ambled about, running errands or chatting outside a bakery that smelled of fresh bread. The normalcy was a relief, and for a moment, I let myself think maybe I'd overreacted. But then I stopped at a tiny gas station on the edge of town, and everything took a turn for the weird. The station attendant, an older man with deep lines across his forehead, watched me with an oddly intense gaze, almost like he'd seen a ghost when I walked in. He barely said a word as I paid for gas and some snacks, but his eyes kept flicking to the forest road I'd come from. It was unsettling. Curiosity got the better of me, so I tried to chat him up. I asked if there were any local attractions or interesting hiking trails I should check out. He just shrugged, muttering something about how folks around here don't wander too far into the woods anymore. When I pressed him for details, he shifted uncomfortably, almost like he regretted saying anything. Eventually, he mentioned that people had been hearing strange sounds at night, cries and whispers that didn't belong to any animal they knew. He said a few campers had packed up and left in a hurry, spooked by whatever was out there. My stomach flipped at his words. In that moment, I realized last night's experience wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Driving back to my campsite, my mind raced with new questions. Part of me wanted to run straight back to Boston's crowded streets, where at least the fears were more ordinary. But another part of me felt drawn to the mystery. I know it sounds crazy. Who in their right mind sticks around a place that screams danger? Yet something about it felt like I needed to see it through, to confirm whether I was braver than the scary stories and weird vibes. Perhaps I also wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't just a city girl who buckled at the first sign of trouble. By the time I reached the dirt path leading to my tent, I was shaking off the doubt and trying to summon some courage. As I parked and stepped out, I noticed footprints near my tent that weren't mine, larger prints, definitely from a boot or shoe. My heart thundered in my chest as I bent down to inspect them. They led around the back of my tent and vanished into the trees. I scanned the area, half expecting someone to jump out from behind a pine trunk. Nobody appeared, but that didn't calm me down any. Instead, I felt violated, like my personal space had been invaded by an unseen visitor. It was scary in a very real way, far beyond the usual jump scares you get from a horror movie. There's something uniquely disturbing about knowing someone was near you while you slept, and you had no clue. My head spun with possibilities. Was it a local messing around? A fellow camper who got lost? Or something more sinister? I didn't have any answers, but I knew I couldn't just pretend everything was fine. The question became, do I stay and face whatever is happening, or pack up, chalk it up to a bad idea, and drive away? My pride was at war with my common sense. A voice in the back of my head whispered, "Leave now," but my stubborn side kept insisting I'd regret running away without answers. So I decided to stick around another night, though I made sure to move my tent a bit closer to my car, in case I needed a quick escape. As evening drew near, I felt the tension coil tighter, like the forest was silently preparing for something. Despite the nerves eating at me, I told myself I'd keep watch after dark, see if the strange cries or footprints returned. It felt dangerous, but maybe this was the only way to get some closure. Little did I know, the events unfolding would shake me to my core and leave me questioning every decision I'd made since rolling into Boston. By the time darkness fell again, my nerves were practically humming. I tried distracting myself by reading an old paperback, but I couldn't focus on the words. The air felt thick, like even the wind was afraid to stir up any noise. Somewhere in my mind, I knew I was gambling with forces I didn't understand, but there was a stubborn streak in me that refused to leave without answers. I set a small lantern on the ground outside my tent, hoping the soft glow might chase away the creepiness that lurked just beyond. When a branch snapped in the distance, my heart nearly leapt out of my chest, but I held firm. I promised myself I'd see this through, whatever that meant. As the night wore on, the forest came alive with unsettling sounds that made every hair on my body stand on end. It wasn't just the usual nocturnal animals rummaging around. There were eerie rustles and distant footsteps that seemed deliberate. Every now and then, I caught the faint hint of what sounded like whispering. It was too soft to make out words, but it draped an extra layer of horror over the entire scene. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I found myself gripping my flashlight tighter than ever. It was a weird mix of adrenaline and dread, the kind of feeling that tells you things are about to get seriously scary. There was a moment when I thought I saw movement between the trees, just a flicker of motion off to my right. I aimed my flashlight, fingers trembling, but the beam only lit up thick trunks and tangled branches. No eyes reflected back, and no silhouette darted away. Still, my gut warned me I wasn't alone. The disturbing sense that someone, or something, was observing me turned my stomach into knots. I tried calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" But the words came out shaky, and the silence that followed was almost worse than any reply. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a wrong move. Suddenly, a soft cry echoed through the darkness, so faint I almost dismissed it as the wind. But when it came again, clearer and more desperate, my blood ran cold. It reminded me of a child sobbing, though there was no logical reason for a kid to be wandering these woods at night. I wanted to run back to the safety of my tent and zip it shut, but the cries sounded heartbreakingly real. Against my better judgment, I edged forward, shining my light into every nook and cranny. Each step felt heavier, as if the soil was clutching at my shoes, dragging me deeper into an unfolding nightmare. Eventually, I reached the stream, which shimmered under the pale moonlight. The crying had stopped by then, replaced by a thick silence that made my pulse thunder in my ears. My flashlight danced across the water, highlighting rocks and tangled branches. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from somewhere nearby. My fingers were clammy against the flashlight's metal casing, and a wave of shaky dread coursed through me. This was the moment, I realized, when most people in scary stories decide they've had enough. But I stood there, caught between the urge to flee and the need to uncover the truth behind these disturbing occurrences. Just as I started to head back, a figure flickered at the corner of my vision, a shadow briefly illuminated by the moon's glow. I whipped my light around and caught a glimpse of a tall shape slipping behind a tree. My stomach lurched as I realized it wasn't just my imagination. Someone was out here with me. "Hello." I called again, my voice wavering. The only answer was a series of rustling noises, as though whoever it was moved deeper into the brush. The rational part of my brain screamed to get out, but a twisted sense of curiosity urged me forward a few more steps, heart hammering, breath catching. That's when I stumbled upon an odd arrangement of sticks and stones near the stream's bank, almost like a crude symbol. A chill ran down my spine at how deliberate it looked, not something nature would casually create. I bent down to examine it, noticing tiny strips of cloth tied around the branches, each cloth stained with something dark. My mind immediately jumped to worst-case scenarios, rituals, or maybe some grim warning meant to scare off trespassers. In the beam of my flashlight, the makeshift symbol looked sinister, radiating a disturbing energy that made me recoil. I couldn't decide if I'd just discovered a clue or a direct threat. Heading back to my campsite felt like it took a lifetime, with the forest pressing in on all sides. Every branch looked like a grasping hand, every shift of moonlight a possible hint of danger. When I finally saw the warm glow of my lantern, I breathed a shaky sigh of relief. But that relief melted into dread when I realized my tent flap was hanging open, even though I'd zipped it closed before leaving. My heart plummeted as I approached, uncertain of what I'd find inside. In that moment, I understood that whatever was happening here was far from random, and I was now fully entangled in a game that might end in something worse than fear. I sat there for a moment, barely breathing, staring at my tent's open flap like it was a portal to something truly scary. My mind raced, trying to guess who, or what, might have gone inside while I was investigating that disturbing arrangement of sticks by the stream. Gathering every ounce of courage, I gripped my flashlight tighter and took a shaky step forward. When I finally peered inside, everything looked mostly in place: sleeping bag, scattered clothes, my half-eaten pack of crackers. But the subtle differences made my blood run cold. My flashlight batteries were spread across the ground, and my personal journal lay open on its last page, though I'd left it tucked away and zipped shut. That deliberate invasion made me feel exposed, like my private world had been turned upside down for reasons I couldn't fathom. My instincts screamed at me to leave right then. Part of me considered jumping into the car and never looking back. But fear can mess with your logic, and some twisted sense of pride or curiosity kept me rooted. Could this intruder still be nearby, watching my reaction? Was this a sick prank, or was I in genuine danger? My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. I stepped back into the night air, scanning the treeline with my flashlight. Nothing moved, but the silence was so oppressive it felt like a living thing pressing against my ears. I remember thinking, is anyone else going through something like this, or am I the only idiot who stayed? Despite how spooked I was, I must have dozed off eventually, because I woke up to a dull gray morning. Everything felt surreal, like I was trapped in a bad dream I couldn't shake. I checked all my gear and discovered a few more unsettling details. My canteen had been emptied, and there were muddy smears on the side of my cooler. No footprints this time, no visible signs of who might have done it, but the evidence was clear: I wasn't alone. I tried to bolster my courage by reasoning it was a desperate hiker or maybe a homeless individual searching for supplies. But some deep part of me was certain this was something else, something more disturbing than mere theft. I decided to spend the day away from camp again, hoping to gather info from the nearby town or at least clear my head. That gas station attendant's odd warning still echoed in my mind. Before leaving, though, I tried to secure my tent better, looping extra cords and even tying a small bell to the zipper so I'd hear if it opened. It felt almost silly, like a kid setting up booby traps. But I couldn't ignore how real the threat felt. As I drove off, my eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure step out from behind a tree. The sense of being watched hadn't diminished with daylight, and it made every mile of that bumpy road feel twice as long. Back in town, I combed through local shops, eavesdropping on gossip and half hoping to bump into someone who could confirm these weird experiences. At a bakery, I overheard two elderly women mentioning how people in the outskirts had been scared off by unusual occurrences, lost pets, strange lights at night, and yes, those haunting cries. My heart pounded as I pretended to browse pastries, listening intently. It wasn't direct proof, but it was something, a small sign I wasn't losing my mind. I wanted to approach them, but I couldn't find the right words without sounding like a complete lunatic. So I just stood there, feeling more connected to the horror around me, and more isolated than ever. It hit me that I should probably talk to the local authorities, but the thought made me shudder. What would I say? Hi, I'm camping in the woods, and someone's messing with my stuff, leaving weird symbols, and possibly stalking me at night. By the way, I have no proof beyond a messy tent and my own shaken nerves. I imagined skeptical stares, or worse, pitying looks that implied I'd watched one too many horror movies. The last thing I wanted was to become local gossip, the out-of-towner who claimed to see ghosts in Boston's backyard. Plus, something in my gut told me that whoever was out there might be a lot more dangerous if I started drawing official attention. I killed time until the afternoon, aimlessly wandering around the small tourist spots and trying to piece together any clues. Part of me was stalling, dreading the moment I'd have to return to that campsite. My phone kept buzzing with texts from friends back home, oblivious to my situation. "How's the big adventure?" they'd ask. I had to bite my tongue, holding back the urge to text them about how horrifying everything felt. The idea of explaining it all seemed impossible. And yet, I realized I couldn't keep it to myself forever. Fear thrives in silence, but I wasn't quite ready to speak up yet. I needed more answers, or at least some tangible proof I wasn't just seeing shadows. Eventually, I couldn't put it off any longer. I had to go back. The sun was sinking, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples. My nerves twisted into a tight coil in my stomach, but I'd made my choice. As my car bumped along the dirt path, every instinct told me to turn around. Still, I pressed on. When I arrived, the campsite seemed eerily still, like the calm before a storm. My eyes darted to the trees, half expecting to see someone lurking there. I remembered the weird symbol by the stream, the footprints, the open tent flap. Deep down, I knew the terror was just getting started, and that once night fell, the real test of my resolve would begin. That evening, a suffocating pressure filled the air, like the forest itself was set on edge. I tried to keep my mind occupied by reading text messages from friends, but I couldn't focus. The campfire crackled in front of me, sending faint sparks into the night sky, yet its warmth did nothing to calm the chill that had settled deep in my bones. I kept remembering the open tent flap, the metal belongings, and that disturbing arrangement of sticks near the stream. My surroundings felt downright scary, and a single thought kept circling through my head. I needed to leave. Despite the gut-wrenching fear that urged me to pack up, I hesitated. Curiosity, pride, or maybe sheer stubbornness made me linger for one more night. I told myself I'd figure out who or what was behind all this, then drive away with answers instead of tormenting questions. I should have trusted my instincts. Past midnight, the forest broke its eerie silence with a piercing scream that had my heart slamming into my ribs. It wasn't an animal cry, and it definitely wasn't the wind. It sounded human, raw and desperate. My first reaction was to scramble toward the car, but my flashlight beam caught the outline of someone stumbling between the trees. Without thinking, I rushed forward, calling out to see if they needed help. Each step felt like a massive gamble, a potential leap into the jaws of something disturbing. The figure limped into a patch of moonlight, and I realized it was an older woman, eyes wide with terror. She clutched at her side, her jacket torn and stained. Before I could get closer, she let out another scream and fell to her knees. I almost dropped my flashlight as I hurried to her side, adrenaline hammering through my veins. She was trembling so badly I could barely understand her broken words. All I caught were fragments. Not alone, chasing me, and get away. Fear spiked in me, but I forced myself to remain calm, gently laying a hand on her shoulder. Her eyes darted frantically around, as if expecting something to burst from the dark at any moment. I told her we could escape in my car, that we'd leave this horrifying place right now. But no sooner had I said it than a rustling in the nearby brush made my stomach turn inside out. Something, or someone, was moving closer. I swept my flashlight toward the sound, trying to steady my quivering grip. The beam caught a glimpse of a figure dressed in ragged clothes, face half hidden behind what looked like a makeshift mask. My blood turned to ice. There was no mistaking the intent in that stance. They were stalking us, watching. A single low growl-like sound reached my ears, and I nearly lost my nerve. My mind flashed to every strange sign I'd encountered. Footprints, the rummaged tent, symbols by the stream. This was no prank, and no random encounter. We were dealing with someone who seemed determined to keep us here, or worse. I backed up slowly, coaxing the terrified woman to follow me. We managed to scramble toward my car, hearts pounding like they might explode. Branches whipped at my arms, my feet snagging on exposed roots. The intruder's footsteps crashed behind us, hot on our trail. In that moment, the forest felt alive with malice, as though the trees themselves leaned in to watch our desperate flight. The woman gasped for air, slowing us down, and I thought about leaving her behind in a moment of raw survival instinct. But conscience wouldn't let me abandon her. My lungs burned, my adrenaline spiked, and I wondered if this was how people vanish without a trace. Lured in by curiosity, then cornered by something truly frightening. We burst into the clearing where my car was parked, and I nearly sobbed with relief. I yanked the door open, shoved her into the passenger seat, and lunged for the driver's side. But in my haste, I fumbled the keys, hearing them clatter to the ground. A cold wave of terror surged through me. I dropped to my knees, hands groping frantically in the dirt, until my fingers finally closed around the key ring. Meanwhile, that masked figure was right on us. I could hear ragged breathing, twigs snapping underfoot. With a trembling hand, I jammed the key into the ignition, my mind screaming for the engine to turn over. When it finally roared to life, I slammed the gas pedal, gravel spraying as we tore out of that clearing. My relief was short-lived. As we sped down the narrow track, my headlights caught sudden movement, a second figure darting across the path. I swerved, losing control for a split second. The car careened off the road, smashing into a tree with a sickening crunch of metal. My head whipped forward, my vision exploding with white spots. Somehow, I stayed conscious, though my entire body throbbed with pain. The passenger door had crumpled inward, pinning the woman. She whimpered, trapped, eyes terrified. Meanwhile, the masked intruder closed the distance, their presence looming in the glare of the damaged headlights. I felt a surge of absolute horror, realizing how alone and vulnerable we were. In a final burst of desperate will, I kicked the door open and managed to pull the woman free, though she was badly hurt. Together, we staggered back onto the roadway, stumbling in a frantic attempt to outrun our pursuer. My mind blurred from the crash, and each step felt unsteady, as though I were wading through water. That's when my foot caught on a rock. I fell hard, the impact jarring every inch of me. The woman tried to help, but she was too weak herself. I looked over my shoulder, hard in my throat, catching a glimpse of our assailant standing under a broken moonbeam. They lifted something in their hand, something sharp, and in that moment, I knew we'd made a fatal mistake. I closed my eyes, my body shaking with regret that I'd stayed here at all, and just prayed for a miracle that never came. That's where it ends for me. A terror I can hardly put into words, the final price paid for a curiosity that drew me too far into the unknown. I don't remember every detail after that, just flashes of agony and fear, a last, desperate scream lost to the silent trees. Sometimes, even now, I'm not sure if I survived or if my mind is haunting me with illusions. But I do know that night in Boston's outskirts changed me forever, proved that some disturbing mysteries should remain unsolved, and that there are places, even near a bustling city, where unspeakable darkness thrives.